So, like Sally, I'd like to welcome everyone here. And this is because this is the first of 6 consecutive Tuesday meetings on this module, the Wisdom of Emptiness. I think it would be very helpful for us if we spent the first few minutes cultivating the kind of motivation which will carry us through not just this evening session, but all of the sessions of this particular module. So some people here are already quite familiar with the process of stilling the physical posture, then stilling and concentrating the mind, and then on such a still basis, cultivating an altruistic motivation. But for the sake of people who might be a bit new to this process, and for the sake of all of us, just so that we keep in mind the important stages of preparation for such a series of sessions as we're about to begin, I will give a few instructions. If you already have internalized these instructions, then you can then just tune me out and proceed at your own pace. And if not, then you can listen. So the first thing we should do is withdraw our awareness within this physical envelope of ours, within this body. In other words, just simply be present with our seating posture. There will be certain sensations and sounds coming to us from the outside. We don't have to worry about blocking them or denying them. We certainly don't have to run after them and pay close attention to them. Just simply allow sights and sensations and sounds and so forth simply to arise by themselves and then to dissolve by themselves, all the while keeping our attention focused primarily on our seated posture. As we do this, as we withdraw our attention, we will start to notice certain sensations that perhaps were not appearing to us previously. For example, the places in which our legs and the lower portions of our body are making contact with our chair or with our cushion. That area of pressure. Perhaps before I just mentioned it, perhaps we were unaware of those sensations. But as we withdraw our attention inwards and focus on our body, we begin to notice such sensations. And it can be useful to focus on those sensations where we are making contact with our seat, to enhance the sense of feeling well supported, well grounded in our physical posture, as if we were attached to the earth, even rooted in the earth. and feel comfortable, completely relaxed. But while we are comfortable and relaxed, not straining to hold this posture or that posture in any unnatural fashion, we should also be upright and alert. And one very simple way of doing this is to pay attention to the sternum, the breastbone, and just lift it slightly. Not in an exaggerated fashion, but just slightly elevate it. And even this slight adjustment in our posture can serve to keep us awake and aware, alert. If we're not sure what to do with our hands, we can either rest them on our knees or fold them in our lap. Perhaps pull our shoulders back just slightly to open up the chest cavity. But again, without straining, without contorting one's posture in any way. And as we sit in this well-grounded yet upright and alert posture, with our attention retained within the envelope of this physical form, we should try to sit as still as we can. But again, within the limits of comfort. And as we sit still in this fashion, we become aware of a rhythmic movement. The movement of our breath. And let this breath, for the next few moments, be the sole focus of our attention. Observe how it flows into us, like the tide flowing into the shore, and then how it flows out again. it can be very helpful when observing the breath in this way to give up the idea that we are breathing the air and instead adopt the position the air is breathing us. It's flowing in, it stays a moment, and then flows out again. And we are merely observing it. There's quite a bit of variety in the breath. Sometimes the air flows in swiftly, other times quite slowly. Sometimes the breath is quite shallow, creating only a very slight motion or a rise in our abdomen. Other times, the air flows into us quite deeply. But we're not judging the breath. We're not controlling it. We're simply staying aware of it, staying in the present moment. So while the breath is going in, we are simply aware. Breath is going in. And while the breath is going out, again, we are simply aware. Breath is going out. Now at this point, I would like us to shift our attention down to the abdomen. As the air flows into us, the abdomen rises. And it falls as we breathe out. Continue to watch his rise and fall of the abdomen as I give an instruction for what to do next. But only after the instruction is finished will I suggest that we follow those particular instructions. So at the moment we notice that the abdomen is filling or rising as we breathe in and subsiding as we breathe out. And we've relaxed control over this process, so it feels as if it's taking place automatically. But in a moment, we're going to take control. We're going to take charge over this process. And we're going to perform 3 full or cleansing breaths. So when it is time to begin that, as we breathe in, allow the abdomen to rise to its fullest extent. Then, the diaphragm itself will open. And finally, the last part of the breath is when we raise our chest. So this full cleansing breath will fill up our belly, then the area of our diaphragm, and finally our chest. Then we hold this breath just for the briefest amount of time, not until we become uncomfortable. Before that happens, while we're still comfortable, then we let out this breath completely, letting it out first from our chest, then our diaphragm, and then empty the abdomen completely. So in this way, we can take a series of 3 complete cleansing breaths. Abdomen, diaphragm, and chest on the way in, and the opposite on the way out. And during these 3 cleansing breaths, pay particular attention to the exhalation. As we breathe out, feel that we are letting go of everything and anything that might be an obstacle. It might be tension, it might be nervousness, it might be a sense of obstruction, it could be tiredness, distraction, any negative state of mind. Any and all such obstacles we let go of completely as we breathe out. When we breathe in, we can feel that we're replacing all of that negative energy with its opposite: clarity, alertness, calmness, awareness. And then on the next exhalation, completely let go of whatever remains in the way of negativity or obstruction. So, perhaps let's do the relaxed breathing to begin with, just a couple of more times. And then when we're ready, take the 3 deep cleansing breaths as I described. Now, having calmed and collected the mind, and having rid ourselves of at least the gross level of interferences with the cleansing breath, we should turn our attention, our concentrated attention, to our motivation. It's the answer to the question, why are we here this evening? And it is possible for us to have a whole range of different motivations for attending this session, for participating here this evening. It could be anything from curiosity to a sincere interest in following the spiritual path. Within the range of these motivations, some are very positive, some are neutral, and some could be quite negative. For example, from my own side, sitting here and being the one responsible for doing the lion's share of the speaking, my motivation might be to have people think well of me, to receive some sort of praise or agreement or an enhanced reputation. To the extent that any of those motivations are present, then whatever teaching I might give would be accordingly polluted. And in a similar fashion, someone sitting listening might also be doing so for the sake of reputation, for the sake of gaining power, or any other simply self-referential motivation. And again, any of the listening done under such motivations would be, in a similar fashion, polluted. Why polluted? Why are these self-referential motivations? Wishing to have an enhanced reputation and the like. Wishing to gain power for oneself. Why are these considered contaminated? So often during this life, we've been following the dictates of this self, this selfish concern, this concern for only our welfare alone. It is as if our motto has been, look out for number one. for me. And we've adopted this strategy because we feel that this is the way to gain happiness, to get what we want. And yet the truth is that by following the dictates of this selfishness, we get precisely what we don't want. Repeated frustration. Anxiety. Conflict. The very opposite of a peaceful, calm, clear existence. Furthermore, this attitude is like a prison. We're imprisoned within this selfish concern for only my own welfare. Yes, we might extend that wish for welfare to a few chosen individuals, but only if they have helped me, if they are somehow part of my extended identity. As for everyone else, as for all other living beings, and even those who are close to us, who might cross us, might cultivate a conflict with us, for all these other beings, we place them at best in second place. And there grows up automatically a distance, a separation. So with our concern selfishly focused only on our own identity, we are cutting ourselves off from others, and also cutting ourselves off from the deepest resources within ourselves. And while we're looking for happiness and well-being and fulfillment, we're only finding their opposites. But as the great texts say, we don't have to make a detailed argument about this. Just look at the difference between ourselves and the enlightened beings, the awakened ones, the great Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. Or, if they are too remote for us to consider, just anyone we know whose heart is opened outwards towards others, who has to some significant extent vanquished this demon of self-cherishing. and compare our frustrated search for happiness while under the sway of selfishness with the expansive happiness of those who have dedicated their lives to others. And while we may think there is a great gap between my experience and the experience of these great Buddhas and Bodhisattvas and altruistic beings, in fact, in one very important way, we are all the same. No one was ever enlightened from the beginning. And everyone has within himself or herself, at the very deepest point of being, the potential for full enlightenment, the potential to break free from this prison of selfishness and cultivate an effortless experience of unlimited compassion, unlimited wisdom, and the unlimited ability to provide skillful help and guidance to others. Having considered this, now we know why we are here. Not to play our ordinary, petty ego games, but to remove from the field of our mind and heart everything that is currently interfering, obscuring, or blocking this enlightened potential. So that we can experience authentic being, release ourselves from this prison, and most importantly, live a life of benefit to others. So let us dedicate ourselves now as strongly as we can, so that whatever is said here, thought, studied, discussed, argued, debated, that all of this serves the purpose of leading us closer to the fulfillment of our enlightened potential. So like the great Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas of the past, present, and those yet to come, we may live our lives as enlightened servants of others. So to whatever extent we can fabricate such an altruistic motivation, let us do so and sit with that motivation for just a moment. Okay, so many of us have already been sitting for nearly an hour. So if you feel the necessity to stand or stretch or bend for a minute, why don't we do that now? And then when we sit down again, we'll continue for a little while before we have a proper break for the tea and coffee and the other things that Sally mentioned. So if you feel helpful to stand and stretch or bend, please do so. Okay. So, as everyone here probably knows, this is the 12th of 13 modules in this Discovering Buddhism series. And the subject matter is called the wisdom of emptiness. And of all of the topics within the Sutra Path to Enlightenment, this is considered the most profound. For that reason, I'm quite shy about leading a course like this. But it's my job. I'd rather skip over it or invite Lama Zopa or someone who has intuitive understanding of this topic to give it instead. But that's not our karma. So, but why is this wisdom of emptiness, why is it such an important, profound topic? Well, it has been said that all of the Buddha's teachings, and here we're talking about a lot of teachings, because those of you who are familiar with the life of Shakyamuni Buddha know that he manifested enlightenment when he was 35 years old, and then taught continuously from then on until he passed away at the age of 80. And then his teachings were memorized and eventually written down. And what we have from the teaching is probably really only a fraction of all the teachings that he gave during those 45 years. But even these teachings come to hundreds of volumes. And then the teachings of the Indian commentators who elucidated the thought of these teachings come to at least twice that number. So when I say all of the teachings, I'm not talking about one or two lines of scripture, but everything that the Buddha and the enlightened beings who followed and elucidated his thought taught, everything is said either directly or indirectly intended to increase our wisdom, to cultivate our wisdom. Some of the teachings are directly related to this goal. For instance, over in the corner here, there's a statue of Manjushri, the sword-wielding Buddha, who represents wisdom. And if you look closely, you'll see that in his left hand, he's holding the stem of a flower, and on that flower is a text. Specifically, it's a text known as the Prajna Paramita, or the Perfection of Wisdom, in 8,000 lines. And this is one of the teachings by Buddha, which is a direct discourse on the cultivation of wisdom. And there are a number of such texts whose main topic is the cultivation of this wisdom. But all of the other teachings are to develop the clarity and the strength and the ability to understand this wisdom, to achieve this wisdom. So even the teachings on cultivating basic ethical discipline, or cultivating love, or patience, or compassion, or any of these topics are given primarily so that the person undergoing their training can elevate himself or herself beyond the present state in which ignorance is predominating in the mind, and achieve an ability, a strength, a clarity to be able to understand the wisdom teachings. So for this reason, everything the Buddha ever taught was for the sake of enhancing wisdom. Why? Why is wisdom so important? Well, wisdom here should not be confused with the knowledge of facts. It's not the accumulation of the knowledge about this or that, though that can help support the cultivation of wisdom to some extent. But we're not here talking about simply knowledge or the collection of facts when we talk about wisdom. We're talking about a direct antidote to ignorance. And the type of ignorance that this wisdom is an antidote towards is the ignorance which is responsible for our suffering, for our sense of dissatisfaction, for whatever restlessness we feel in our life, for whatever sense of dis-ease. Whenever we feel that life is not going the way we would like it to go, whenever we have an experience of mental or physical or emotional pain, all of these are said, without exception, to derive from this basic ignorance. And the purpose for Shakyamuni Buddha and any Buddha who appears in any world system is solely to alleviate suffering. That's the only reason. It's the only reason why a bodhisattva strives to become a Buddha, and it's the only reason why Buddhas manifest in the world, is to help others alleviate their suffering. But the insight of the Buddhas is such that the root cause of all of this suffering, dissatisfaction, frustration, dis-ease, and the like, all of it, without exception, stems from one cause: ignorance. And so since the goal is to help others overcome this suffering, and since ignorance is the root cause of this suffering, then it's the cultivation of wisdom which is most important. Because wisdom, as I said, is the direct antidote to this ignorance. Why does this have to be emphasized? Well, for several reasons. Take, for example, the case where we think, well, I'm a good person, right? I don't cheat. I'm honest. I try to get along with my neighbors and my family and so forth. You know, when the light turns green, I help little old men and little old ladies across the street. You know, I try to do good. And that is good. And the Buddha would applaud. Right? But in and of itself, such activities, if they're not combined with the cultivation of wisdom, do not lead to the eradication of suffering and dissatisfaction. Okay. It's not that there's anything wrong with such activities, with being honest, being fair, being helpful. In fact, there's everything right with them. It's just that by themselves, they're insufficient, because by themselves, they don't remove ignorance. The specific ignorance, which is the root cause of suffering. Okay. Now, it's true that those types of activities, helpful, beneficial, ethical activities, put us in a position, a better position, to cultivate the wisdom that destroys ignorance. This is quite true. But if it's not conjoined with that wisdom, by itself, those activities are powerless. While they can lead to temporary experiences of happiness and well-being, they cannot eradicate the root cause of suffering and dissatisfaction. Only the cultivation of wisdom can do that. Okay. So, we have an experience in our life of unwanted suffering, frustration, dissatisfaction, whatever name you want to call it, restlessness, the sense of incompletion, self-alienation, whatever it might be. We have that experience. And we're told from the Buddha's teachings that they all come down, they all have their ultimate source in ignorance. So then the question, whose direct antidote is wisdom. So then the question becomes, well, what is the nature of this ignorance? And hence the nature of the wisdom that opposes it. And here, again, we have to be quite clear. Because as many people have heard on a number of occasions, the type of ignorance that is the root cause of suffering is not a simple ignorance in which we don't know something. It's not that kind of ignorance. Right? Because sometimes when we use the word ignorance, when we say I'm ignorant of something, it just simply means here's an object of knowledge and I don't know it. So I'm ignorant of it. Right? That's a very ordinary use of the word ignorance. Okay. So we can think of many, many examples. I usually use an example of some language that I don't know. You know, like make up a language. Serbo-Croatian, I think that's a language. Okay? Well, I don't know it. So I'm ignorant of it. Right? And for some people, they might be ignorant of trigonometry or, ignorant of how to cook a delicious meal. Or ignorant of so many things. Right? So there we have an object of knowledge. We have our lack of knowledge or lack of understanding about it. Therefore, we say we're ignorant of it. That is not the ignorance we're talking about. That is not the ignorance that is the root cause of suffering. Rather, the ignorance that we're talking about is a misconception about reality. It's not a lack of knowledge. It's what we might call a mistaken knowledge. In other words, if we have a conception that something is this way, when in fact it's that way, then this idea that it's this way is an ignorant conception. It does not accord with the way that thing actually is. So in other words, it is like a superimposition of a thought, a conception, a notion, onto what does exist. So sometimes when ignorance is being spoken of in the teachings, we come across terms like projections. And actually, those are excellent. Terms like that, terms like projections, are really excellent for getting towards the idea of how ignorance functions. That word projection, what does that mean? Project means to throw ahead, doesn't it? Right? Pro means forward or ahead or in front of. Inject, like eject, means to throw. So if we have a projector with film in it, then it's throwing the picture in front of us onto the screen. Well, in a sense, as our minds are under the influence of the type of ignorance that I've been talking about, this basic ignorance which is responsible for any of our sense of suffering, dissatisfaction, and the like. While we're under that influence, it is as if our mind is projecting a picture, an image, an idea, a notion out there onto what does exist, onto, to speak very loosely, onto reality. Okay. And then, instead of us relating to the underlying reality that's out there, we relate instead to an image which we ourselves have projected. So, another way of putting this is, instead of seeing things as they are, we're seeing them as our mind falsely or mistakenly conceives them to be. Okay. So now we're getting closer to a feeling for what this basic ignorance is like. It's in the nature of a misconception, a misknowing, not a not knowing of reality, rather a misknowing of reality. Okay. Now, when we try to get closer, to kind of surround this topic and get a more and more accurate feel for it, I myself find it helpful, just the way my own mind works, to start with examples which are quite easy to relate to, even if they are not the most philosophically advanced examples. Get a hold of them, and then from that position begin to move forward. And if we adopt that approach, then we can take as an example the way we relate to somebody who fits a particular racial or ethnic profile. Okay, let's take that as an example. So, unfortunately, right now, with the political situation in the Middle East and so forth, there seems to be a concerted effort to cast people who fit a Middle Eastern profile as the villain. Right? Actually, it seems like this is a really widespread attempt which is taking place on all levels. Governmental levels, entertainment levels. Turn on the TV, you go to the movies, and you see people who fit a certain Middle Eastern profile cast in villainous roles. Now, I'm willing to be corrected about this, but that's been my perception. Anyone have an argument with it? Yeah.
My only argument is I think it's gone on longer than we might think.
Yeah, right. That's the problem, right? Like when I was in school, I was told that during I'm not old enough to remember World War I, okay? But I was told that during World War I, it was necessary to drum up a lot of anti-German sentiment because, frankly, there was a lot of people who preferred to have been anti-British than anti-German. So in order to gear people up to support that war, they had to actually have a very concerted propaganda effort to cast Germans as the bad guys. And this was a very well thought out, very well planned propaganda thing. Boy. So throughout history, I'm just using these examples because they're present to us, but I would venture hardly any civilization has been free of this kind of activity. Right? There's one of the ways that the members of a civilization cultivate a group identity is by casting someone else as the villain. Okay. So the villain can be Arabs, Germans, black people, white people, men, women, any group based on any characteristic, could be there. So let's say we're confronting someone who's a member of that target group, right? You know, whatever it is. And let's say we've fallen for the propaganda. Let's say we don't have any close personal friends who are from an Arab background or from a German background or whatever example we wanted to use. Because if we have close personal friends who come from the background, then we're a little bit immune to the propaganda. Because we know here's another human being just like myself. You know, someone we can like, someone we could love, perhaps. But if we have no person like that in our personal experience, then we might fall for the propaganda. Okay? So that means that when we see a person, let's choose a man just to keep the pronouns a little simple. Okay? Let's say there's a man who fits that profile. Then, to a very real extent, when we encounter that person, he himself is invisible. Okay? We only see enough of him to arouse the prejudice. And what is prejudice but a projection? Right? It's an image projected out onto a person which obscures us from seeing the reality of that person. That's all it is. Okay? So the underlying person, the person who might have a wife whose children might go to school with our children, a person who we might become close friends with if we got to know, you know, a person we might end up disliking for other reasons, you know, other than the fact that he happens to fit a particular profile. In other words, a real person. That real person is, to our sight, invisible. Okay. So, what is visible is a screen which is an appropriate screen to take the image that we're projecting. And that is the person that we relate to. Of course, until we get to know him better, if there's a chance. If we give ourselves a chance to know that person better. Right? And even from this example, we can see that automatically, we, by falling prey to this type of ignorance, to mistaking this kind of projection for the underlying reality, we're automatically creating a problem for ourselves. Especially, you know, the example that's just used of prejudice or racial intolerance and so forth. Of course, we all know what a big problem that is. Okay, the predisposition to hatred, to anger, to violence is all there. It's all ready. We just need a trigger to set it off. It not only creates a problem in terms of our relationship with that other person or the members of that group, but it creates an internal problem for ourselves. So even if we were living in an apartment, walled off from the outside world and never actually had to encounter such a person, the very thought that we're harboring, the very image that we're harboring is creating a problem for us, right in our heart, right in our mind. A certain hardness, a certain tension, a certain anxiety. Now, this example that I'm using is not a full, final example of the ignorance that is the root cause of all suffering. Right? And the wisdom that sees that people aren't, our projections of them is not the wisdom of emptiness that I was talking about. Right? But it begins to give us an understanding of how the ignorance that is the root cause of suffering operates, and how the wisdom, which is the antidote to that ignorance, also operates. So ignorance operates by confusing us, or confusing our image of reality, a mistaken conception of the reality, for reality. And wisdom operates by cutting through those projections, those misconceptions, and removing them. So there's a word I learned rather recently, which I kind of like using with any new word. The wisdom of emptiness has a certain subtractive quality to it. Right? When we think of wisdom, or a rough synonym to wisdom, knowledge, wisdom, knowledge, we tend to think of it as the more I learn, the more facts I gather, the clearer idea I'll have of something. Right? So wisdom becomes kind of additive. First I know this, and then I know that, and I know that, and I know more and more details, and finally I arrive at a picture of truth, reality, the way things are. Okay? That's often the way we relate to the cultivation of wisdom in our ordinary sense. But here, and there is some element of that here as well. There are things to learn, okay? But more importantly, there are things to unlearn. In other words, a subtractive, the cultivation of wisdom is a subtractive endeavor. We're attempting to strip away from the field of the objects and the people and even our sense of self, everything that we encounter, we're attempting to strip away from that all of the projections and misconceptions in which we've covered them. Okay? So it isn't so much learning how things are, it's cutting through how they aren't. Stripping away, peeling away. So in some texts, in some commentaries, we might come across explanations like, to speak in a very figurative manner, reality is like an onion, and it's only when you peel away all the layers of the onion that you come to the final truth. Mm-hmm. So this is what I mean by the cultivation of wisdom having this being largely a subtractive endeavor. We begin by identifying how it is that we view things, then subjecting this view to analysis to see if it stands up or not, to see if it's logical, to see if it makes sense. Right? And if we find that it doesn't, if we see that it doesn't stand up, if it's filled with holes, that it is in fact a product of ignorance, then we have seen through the misconception. We've cut through it. And so it is as if we've let down that burden. Then it isn't really necessary for us to ask, okay, so underneath what really exists, because having removed the misconception, we see what exists. We have a direct experience. Sometimes the direct experience of what exists can't be put into words. In fact, it is said ultimately, the ultimate way in which things exist is beyond thought or expression. But that doesn't mean that it's unknowable. Okay. The fact that we can't put precise words to reality doesn't mean that it's impossible to know reality. And an example that I like to use that I borrowed from some of my teachers is we might not be able to describe accurately the sweet taste of honey and how it differs from the sweet taste of sugar, for example. I think that's impossible. I think it's impossible, even if we were Shakespeare, to come up with language which would accurately convey that difference or that experience. But we can know what the taste of honey is. We just have to put it on our tongue. Right? So something similar, something somewhat similar is involved here. We don't have to build up an accurate picture of the way things are. We more have to remove the inaccurate projections of the way we misconceive things to be. Having removed them, we have an experience, we have the opportunity to have a direct experience of reality, whether or not that reality can be put into words. And there's a reason why this underlying reality evades being described by words, thought, or expression. Because words themselves, and the thoughts that relate to them, are just too gross. To define them in another way, they're too dualistic. In other words, when we use a word, we're automatically invoking its opposite. In other words, if I point out this clock, for example, then even without mentioning it, I am excluding everything that is not this clock. So here, in the midst of everything that's not clock, is clock. In other words, the very word itself is setting up a division. It's as if around this object, I always like to use the example of a thick black crayon mark has been drawn. And what I'm referring to exists within that round circle drawn by that black crayon. But when you draw a circle around something, you're at the same time drawing a circle around everything else. Aren't we? Right? I'm drawing a circle around this. At the same time, this circle is the outer circumference of everything else. So in other words, words are dualistic in the sense they divide. But where are the points of division between things? For example, where's the point of division between yourself and your neighbor? So we might say, well, I exist here, from my gut outwards until I reach the level of my skin. That's my black crayon mark, my skin. But when you start looking at it really closely, that skin, which seems to be the black crayon mark that separates me from what's not me, or me from you, okay, turns out to be very porous indeed. Right? I mean, if we're born and bred in Santa Cruz, then this is not taking into account our aura. Right? The aura can extend quite some distance, I'm told. Okay? So then, the idea of I will have to extend to however far my aura reaches. And who knows? Within that aura, there might be other people, or flying insects, or whatever. Right? So are they part of me? Okay. And then for those of us not born and bred in Santa Cruz, who can't really relate to the example of auras so easily, okay? Then there's smell. What does smell mean? If someone can sense us coming because they can smell us before we've arrived, then what are they smelling? There must be molecules coming off of my body that's reaching their olfactory sense, and that's what they're relating to. So again, where's the boundary between self and not self, between me and not me? We can make a surrounding, we can do something provisionally and say, for the sake of argument, what I am is on this side of this border, this side of the skin, and so forth. But when we start checking really, really carefully, these borders that we make between self and others, between thing and not thing, between this and that, those borders turn out to be quite arbitrary, don't they? And if someone has done some study in the area of subatomic particles, nuclear physics, and so forth, then this becomes a predominant reality of quantum mechanics and so forth. That it's a joke to think that you can circumscribe a subatomic particle and say it exists on the inside of the circle and not on the outside. Quantum physics says that's completely mistaken. That's just not the way things work on that level. But we're not dealing with that microscopic level here. But something like that pertains to our everyday reality as well. So words, the reason words can't express ultimate reality is because ultimate reality has this, no, I take that back. Because the way things exist and the way they function are of an interdependent nature, not as sharply defined as words would have it. So trying to use words to describe the way things actually function in this world is only provisional. It's clumsy. But as I said, the fact that it's beyond ordinary words and ordinary expression doesn't mean that reality is unknowable. It just means it cannot be expressed in those modes of discourse, in those modes of thought. Right? Okay. So, I'm going to change today around quite a bit. What I'm going to do now is have a lopsided break because it's already 8:30. We'll have a break and for 10 minutes, and when we come back, instead of my continuing on this in this way, I'm going to say a few things about how we'll approach this course, and also open it up to questions and discussion. Right? So why don't we give ourselves until 20 above 9 and then we resume. So we don't have a great deal of time left, but there are a few things I'd like to point out, and if there's time then maybe we can address some points for questions or discussion. One thing is that for those who are new to the Discovering Buddhism series, then just to point out that you've been handed out, or everyone who's registered, I believe, has been handed out this packet, which is just simply called, it's just titled 12, Wisdom of Emptiness. So that's the packet of recommended or required readings for this course. Does everyone who wants such a package have such a package? Okay. But though the readings are by extraordinary lamas like Denpa Lodja Rinpoche, Lama Zopa Rinpoche, Lama Yeshe, and so forth, not all of the readings, in my opinion, are of equal applicability to this course. Right? So you're certainly welcome to read it all. And if you had another teacher, I would demand that you read it all. But I'm not going to do that, because it's a little bit like hitting my head against the wall, I'm afraid. But also because I have varying opinions as to how helpful all of these readings will be for this course. But what I definitely think will be helpful, especially for next week, is the third reading, which is called Seeking the I by Lama Zopa Rinpoche. So if you don't have it in front of you, the table of contents, it's on page 1, which is actually about maybe the 4th page from the top of the packet. It says table of contents. And then the third title under that is called Seeking the I. And it says pages 9 through 12. I think most of you have seen that? Okay. It's very short, just a few pages. And even though what precedes it, the two by Denpa Lodja Rinpoche, the Wisdom of Emptiness and the Two Truths, even though these are excellent in their own way, my feeling might be, and perhaps I'm being overly cautious, is that they might raise more questions than they answer. So you're free to read them, but if you come across things that you find a little confusing, just put it aside. Okay? Then, at the bottom of that page, there is a section which is called Further Required Reading Includes the Following Texts. You see that? Mm-hmm. And there's 3 texts that are mentioned. One by Landaw called Virtue and Reality, a selection of pages from Pupolkaram, which is Liberation of the Palm of Your Hand, and the third one by Geshe Rupton called Echoes of Voidness. Now, Echoes of Voidness is a great book. It's very hard to find. Very, very hard to find. So, before the class started, I was informed that when other people have been teaching this course, and the recommendation from the office from which this material originates, they said that in place of that, in place of Echoes of Voidness, if you're interested, there's another book which is available. It's I think it's simply called the Heart Sutra. But Geshe Sonamichi? Yes. Here it is. It is just called the Heart Sutra. The Heart Sutra. And the author is Geshe Sonam Rinchen. Sonam Rinchen. And I'll spell it. Geshe was the same here as in Geshe Rupton. Geshe is like a doctor of divinity or doctor of philosophy. It's a title applied to certain lamas who've finished certain education. Geshe Sonam Rinchen. Sonam is S-O-N-A-M. S-O-N-A-M. Sonam. Which means merit, by the way. Merit. And Rinchen. R-I-N-C-H-E-N. Rinchen. And I'm not sure. I think that means great jewel. Is that what it means? Great jewel? Something like that. Great jewel of merit. Okay. So and even though this comes under the heading required text, it's really only required for those people who are taking this course for accreditation. And hardly anyone's been taking any of my courses for that. But they are recommended reading for everyone. Okay? And also the Heart Sutra is a wonderful text. Remember I told you that the text in the hand of Manjushri, the Buddha of Wisdom, is one of the Prajnaparamita, or perfection of wisdom texts. And it's said to be the one that he's holding is said to be the one in 8,000 stanzas. 8,000 lines. Well, there are texts which are much, much longer than that, and texts which are much, much shorter than that. And one of the shortest versions of these perfection of wisdom or Prajnaparamita texts is what's known as the Heart Sutra. And if you go to a Tibetan monastery or a Japanese Zendo or so many different Buddhist communities, at the beginning of teachings, they will recite the Heart Sutra, because in the space of about a page and a half, all of Buddha's most profound teachings are there, in very abbreviated and rather cryptic form. And so it is something which is recited to remove obstacles and prepare the mind for gaining realizations. And it's also something which serves as the basis for commentary. And in the commentary, then one actually receives the explanation of what this perfection of wisdom text is saying. Many of you perhaps know a line from the Heart Sutra. Right at the heart of the Heart Sutra, there's a line which says, "Form is emptiness, emptiness is form." And that little phrase is almost like a koan. Is kind of the very right at the very center of this sutra, and then the explanation of it, why that can be said, why that's true, then becomes the subject of the commentarial tradition. So, if you are looking to do additional reading or supportive reading, then since Echoes of Voidness is very difficult to find, and the Heart Sutra by Gensho Rinchen is, his commentary is excellent and easy, then I recommend that. There are also other commentaries to the Heart Sutra. His Holiness the Dalai Lama has an excellent commentary, and many others as well. So that was one thing I wanted to say. So that, the Heart Sutra, the very strong recommendation that we read this Seeking the I for next time. Okay. The teachings on the cultivation of this wisdom of emptiness in reference to that, one of my teachers once said, we should be prepared to hear things that we haven't heard before, or be prepared to hear things that are contrary to our ordinary way of thinking or viewing. And that's quite true. That's true. One Indian master said, if we want to get a good understanding of the false view of reality, then just look at our ordinary perceptions. They're all wrong. That was a kind of a sloppy paraphrase of what he actually said. But basically, there's a sense that there is a very deep-rooted mistake in the way we understand this world of appearances. And getting a correct view is like waking up from a sleep. Mm-hmm. And so it's very, very helpful to become familiar with the lay of the land. In other words, what the topics are, what the vocabulary is that's used to cultivate this wisdom of emptiness. To become a bit familiar. Because if we just hear a little bit, or read a little bit, then this is a subject which is very, very easy to lead to misconceptions. And we don't, as the teachings themselves say, we don't need any more misconceptions. So for instance, let's say someone had the most fleeting contact with a teaching about this wisdom, and they would say, oh, the wisdom of emptiness. Oh, I understand it. Nothing exists. Right? Well, that's justifiable. Right? Because when we think of emptiness, we think of the absence of something, the lack of something. Right? So the wisdom of emptiness, they put two and two together, and they get 17. And they come to the conclusion that the teachings are saying that nothing exists. Right? Well, it's wrong. It's understandable that someone might jump to that conclusion, but it's wrong. Right? So if we read enough and expose ourselves to enough teachings, then we can avoid those, at least those gross, obvious mistakes. Because in our readings, we'll come across comments which talk about things having conventional existence. So how can you talk about things having conventional existence and then be totally non-existent at the same time? Right? So at least it points us in the right direction. There's still quite a bit of work we have to do to digest the meaning, but just getting that general lay of the land is very helpful. And I'd like to repeat something that I had said in a previous course, because I think it's very applicable here. In general, the cultivation of wisdom, whether it be the wisdom of emptiness or any other wisdom, any other understanding, insight, takes place on three levels. First, there's the wisdom, it's often simply called the wisdom of hearing. And that's when we make our initial contact with subject matter, whatever subject matter we're engaged in. We just hear it or read it. The wisdom of hearing also incorporates reading something. Okay? So at that time, we're not getting great explanations. We're just hearing it about the subject. And if our wisdom of hearing is too thin, we don't have enough to go on. So that's why it's recommended to hear widely and read widely, but wisely as well. In other words, we don't want to confuse ourselves by, having intellectual indigestion by reading too much. But if we have good sources of information, like books of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, for example, that talk about a subject like this, then it's very, very helpful to expose ourselves to it. So we get a general idea of what's being discussed. That's the first wisdom. Then there's the wisdom, it's often called the wisdom of thinking. It could also be called the wisdom of investigation or examination. And with this, we take the material that we've been exposed to through hearing or reading, and we begin to subject it to analysis. Does it make sense? Is it consistent? Does it describe my experiences? Like that. And we apply all these different approaches. We don't just say, oh, well, the Buddha said it or the Dalai Lama said it, therefore it must be true. No. Buddha wouldn't be very happy with that approach. We engage with it. Lama Yeshe used to say, be skeptical. Right? It's helpful at this point to be skeptical. Not to be cynical, that's something else. But skeptical. In other words, applying kind of clear-sighted thought about what it is that we're hearing, what we're reading. Investigating all manners of ways. Then finally, when our wisdom of hearing and thinking has progressed far enough, and we've cultivated some level of understanding, then we apply the third wisdom, the wisdom of meditation. And what this means, there's many forms of meditation, and in fact, a lot of the thinking that takes place in the second wisdom is a form of meditation. But here, the wisdom of meditation has a rather specific connotation to it. And that is, we take the object of our understanding that we've cultivated through the wisdom of hearing, the wisdom of thinking, and we place it in the focus of our single-pointed attention. The same kind of single-pointed attention that we were applying simply to the breath in the beginning, where if our mind is distracted to something else, we bring it back to the breath, right? And not let it buy into all the other distractions. Well, with that same focused mind, we pay attention single-pointedly, or as single-pointedly as possible, to whatever understanding we've cultivated through the first two wisdoms. The metaphor I love to use for this is we marinate our mind in the experience. Right? We allow our mind to soak up the conclusion, the understanding, the insight that we've gained through the two previous wisdoms, so it actually becomes the flavor of our mind. And it's through this three-part cultivation of wisdom, the wisdom of hearing, the wisdom of thinking, and the wisdom of meditating, as just defined, it's through that transformation takes place. We're not transformed by reading a book or listening to a lecture. We're not transformed even by thinking about it. We are transformed when it becomes a living, breathing part of ourselves, so that we actually begin to perceive things through that wisdom, through that understanding. And that only happens when we go through all 3 stages. Okay? So the most that we can provide here for a course like this is a kind of a scattershot approach to the first wisdom, which you'll be exposed to different things that you'll hear and read, right? And some instructions on how to investigate what you're being exposed to, and maybe a little bit of experience of cultivating a single-pointed concentration or something vaguely resembling that on the subject matter at hand. But hopefully, on the basis of that, then after such a brief 6-part course, then you'll be in a better position to receive these teachings and benefit from these teachings when you have the opportunity to receive them from the true master. And that, of course, would be wonderful. Okay. Well, actually, I've used up all my time, but I did promise that I'd entertain a question, so I will do one, so I won't be a total liar. Anybody? Yes, please.
Is there any, my question is actually about the Pope, and is there any intersection between the passing of the Pope and all the attention worldwide that is being brought to this process and this particular event and the topic at hand tonight?
Do you think there is?
There has to be. I personally can't recall a time when the entire world has paid attention to an individual like this since the assassination of John Kennedy. Yeah.
Okay, but
I mean, there's an enormous amount of energy out there right now regarding this particular event. And I don't have an answer. I was just wondering if you had a take on it. And forgive me if this is a really obtuse question, considering what you presented tonight.
I haven't thought about the passing of the Pope and the world's reaction to it in relationship to the teachings on emptiness. And right at the moment, no flags are being raised in my mind. But clearly, it's related to many, many other elements within the Dharma teachings. Very clearly. For example, people's attitudes towards death, that and the Terry, how do you pronounce it? Shiloh, that case, a lot of the things I've heard and read indicate that people have a tremendous interest in death, but an incredible ignorance about what's involved in death and dying, and are allowing decisions to be made by others who are as ignorant as themselves, So the death of two beings attracting such world attention certainly relates to the teachings on death and dying, which are so integral to Buddhism. That's one thing. Another thing is that someone, whether we agree with internal church politics or not, the Pope clearly was a person of great, moral courage. I happen to be one who thinks that some of his policies were mistaken, but there's no denying that he had this kind of personal courage and magnetism and, strength of character. And it's quite interesting that people should respond to that in a day and an age when a lot of the people who are taking headlines have anything but strength of character. Be willing to forgive a person for a lot of mistaken, policies, just on the basis of a certain basic uprightness of character. So the fact that people can relate to that, I think, is significant. Again, I don't know that it has anything to do with the wisdom of emptiness, but it certainly has something to do with our innate human recognition of some kind of goodness. We don't have to completely agree with someone for us to call that person good, but to see that they really are devoted to the welfare of others, whatever the limits of their vision might be, truly devoted to that and so forth. That's significant. I had, if you don't mind a personal anecdote, which is very roughly related to what you were saying, but not exactly. I was visiting, I knew I was going to be visiting England in 1997, and the plans were already made, and then shortly before that, Princess Diana died in the car crash. And so I knew I was going to be in London while the funeral was taking place. And my first reaction was, I don't really want to be there for that. There's all this hype, and, I get sick when I read in newspapers, when they hype things like that. And I just kind of, and then I thought, it's going to be difficult getting around, all the people and stuff. So I was had a rather negative mindset. And some of my very closest friends in the world live in London. So I was really looking forward to spending time with them. And I thought that this was going to really be a bummer. And I had a completely unexpected reaction and experience there. Because I've lived a lot of my life in England. And as a culture, the English aren't the warmest people on the face of the earth. They're not like the Italians or the Spanish, right? Reserved, yes. Stiff upper lip and like. There's a lot of that going down. But when my friends and we were watching the funeral like everyone else on television, and then when things quieted down a little bit, we headed off to Kensington Palace in the gardens, which is kind of in the center of London, which had been our home. And so we headed over there to be there. And as we got out of the subway, and we got up onto the city streets, and we were walking towards it, we were in a different world. We were in an England that I had never experienced before. And people, if I can use a kind of new agey language, people were right in the center of their heart chakra. Everybody. Everybody. It was extraordinary. It was extraordinary. And we went there, and we were reading all the cards and looking at all the flowers and the little placards and the handmade things that were made. Hundreds and thousands of these in Kensington Gardens. And the feeling was, there was a recognition of goodness. What people were relating to was not a glamour puss, not someone who appears on the cover of magazines, not someone who wears the nicest clothes, and not someone who's involved in marital infidelities and stuff. Not that. That's not what people were relating to. They were relating to someone who had heart. Someone who had touched AIDS victims. The first time, that a public figure had touched AIDS victims, really touched them, physically and emotionally, who had devoted herself to removing landmines, for example. Many people had stories of just her humanness, right? So it wasn't like the death of a movie star, which in a sense, she was. It was the passing of a princess, a princess of the heart, In fact, one of the predominant things that you saw as you went around Kensington Gardens were Queen of Hearts. People had taken Queen of Hearts out of decks and put it, and they were referring to her as the Queen of Hearts. And it was so unexpected and so un-British, In fact, I read commentaries later that people were saying, this is, in fact, what the British are like. They just have this veneer of respectability and stiff upper lip over it, which has been, cultivated for one reason or another. But underneath, like everyone else, it's the heart center, which is their true home. And it was It was magical. You know, I've never in the West been in the center of that kind of experience. You know, it was sad, right, because she had died, but it was beyond sad. Sad doesn't begin to explain it. You know, it was almost a gratitude that through her passing, people were in touch with their hearts and the hearts of others. There was no pushing or shoving, and there was thousands of people in Kensington Gardens. It was really crowded, but it was as if it wasn't crowded at all. There was no sense of hurry, pushing, shoving, none of that. You know, people were kind to each other. It was extraordinary. It was truly extraordinary, you know. And as I said, I might not have been so surprised if it had been in another country. But there it was truly touching. And it lasted a while. You know, there was kind of like a grace period. I was in London, so I don't know what was happening in the rest of the world, but London existed in a state of grace for a period of time. You know? So, the only reason I bring that up is I think people who recognize some goodness in the Pope and are relating to his passing on that level, then it would be, it might be similar. It might relate to the fact that, you know, we're on the lookout for goodness. Glamour, yeah, that's fine. That sells newspapers. You know, excitement, all of those things. But those, you know, pale into insignificance compared to the heart.
John, you mentioned the word glamour, which my understanding comes from Scotch Gaelic. It means a false sense of beauty. When you were talking about the onion and the peels of the onion, the truth is, would then, as I understand it, would be, you were talking about reality? Is that right? And the truth is at the core.
Or let's say the search for reality.
Right. So is it the search? In other words, is it the movement in peeling away each core that is in fact the truth?
Is the search for truth the truth?
Because I'm not exactly sure what the objective is if you were to peel away. And my other question relating to that is that bothers me is each layer is a reality, is that, and a truth because it is a reality. So I'm wondering if it's relative, if truth is relative.
I'm not going to try to touch that too much because, first of all, you know, reality isn't an onion.
Sorry, John. I didn't say that so loud.
Right? You know, that's just, it's an example, an analogy. And examples and analogies have, well, it's actually an analogy. They have value. I love analogies. But they should never be confused for reality. You know, they're trying to convey some idea. And the image of the onion, what it's trying to convey, is that we're trying to strip away false conceptions. And false conceptions are by definition false. They're not true. But there are reasons. There are reasons that we have them. And we will be going into that. And then what you end up with underneath, well, that's why I indicated that words and expression aren't formulated for catching that subtlety of reality, but we can experience it anyway. So, as you can tell, it's time for us to go. For those of you who have not yet gone.
Thank you. Thank you, John.